Booth University College YouTube channel for viewing. And now to introduce our guest. Dr. Roger Green retired in 2016 after 46 years of teaching at Barrington College, Asbury College, and Gordon College. He is a lifelong member of the Salvation Army, having distinguished himself over the past half century as one of the leading scholars of Salvation Army history. He has written critical biographies of both Catherine Booth and William Booth. His revised doctoral dissertation has been republished as War on Two Fronts, William Booth's Theology of Redemption. He has also co-edited with Dr. Andrew Eason collections of the shorter writings of both William and Catherine Booth. Roger is the founding co-editor of the Salvation Army journal Word and Deed. And as we'll discover this evening, he continues his research with the writing of a biography of General Bramwell Booth. Evident throughout his research is his deep love for the Salvation Army and his commitment to rigorous scholarship. Roger's in demand as a speaker around the Army world. He was the first soldier to be appointed to the International Doctrine Council. Booth University College has conferred an honorary Doctor of Divinity upon Dr. Green, and the Salvation Army has admitted him to the Order of the Founder. But perhaps most importantly for some of our viewers tonight, Roger has family roots in Newfoundland. Roger and his wife Karen live in Danvers, Massachusetts, near Boston, from where he joins us this evening. So tonight it's both a professional and a personal pleasure to welcome my good friend and colleague, Dr. Roger Green, to this Earl Robinson Memorial Lecture Series. Good evening, Roger. Welcome.
Hello, Don. It's good to be here.
I'm glad you're able to be with us, Roger, and to share in this experience tonight. Something new for both of us in some ways. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation this evening about the work that you're doing at this time.
I am too, Don. And I just want to say thank you for this invitation to join this lecture series. It's been a joy for me to do this for two reasons. First of all, to work with you and with Booth University College in this lecture series. But even more important than that, this lecture series honors Colonel Earl Robinson. And like you, he was a good friend of mine as well. And I admire the work of Earl so much, not only there, but in what he continued to do in his wonderful work. He was a model of a Salvation Army officer, and he was a model for someone who worked hard for the kingdom of God, and a model for someone who loved the broader church, the body of Christ. And he was a remarkable person. And for those of us who knew him, we stand in his debt. So I'm very pleased to be part of this lectureship for that reason as well. So thank you.
Well, good. Roger, I want to start tonight by asking simply, how did you come to begin working on a biography of Bramwell Booth? You've written biographies of both William Booth and Catherine Booth previously. What brought you to the task of writing a biography of Bramwell Booth?
I wish I could say that it was my idea solely. It wasn't. As a matter of fact, it was the idea of a very, very good friend of mine, Major Peter Farthing of Australia. Peter and I both were at the International Congress in 2015. And during the Congress, Peter came to me and asked if he could speak to me about a possible biography of Bramwell Booth, and wanted me to enter into a partnership with him in writing this biography. Well, I was pleased by this very much, and we agreed that when we both retired and had some time, we would begin this biography of Bramwell Booth. There are a couple of motivations for this from Peter, and which I certainly agreed with. First of all, Bramwell Booth's life ended in a rather tragic way. He was seen finally by the High Council to be unfit for office for health reasons. He wanted to, of course, have his own successor that he named. And of course, the High Council that was put in place in 1904, but the High Council decided that they were going to elect the next general and not have Bramwell Booth name the next general. And so it was really a very difficult time for Bramwell Booth. And often we remember Bramwell Booth because of what happened in 1929. And Peter wanted to kind of rectify that because there is so much good that Bramwell Booth did for the sake of the Salvation Army and for the sake of the kingdom. And Peter's thinking about naming this book the architect of the Salvation Army. He really was. So he was a remarkable person and deserves this kind of credit. Also, there's been no other biography written about Bramwell Booth except 1933. One of his daughters, Catherine Bramwell Booth, wrote a biography of her father. It's a bit difficult to read. It's not chronologically easy to read. Sometimes it's hagiography rather than biography. And so we haven't had a good biography of Bramwell Booth. And so Peter wanted to make sure that that record was clarified now. So it was through Peter Farthing and bringing me into partnership with him that we got into this project.
You've mentioned already that Bramwell Booth may be best known as the general who was removed from office. I take it that you don't think that's really a fair remembrance of what he did and what he accomplished and contributed to the Army. Am I correct in that?
Yes, it's part of the story, and we'll certainly tell that story for people who aren't familiar with the story. It's part of the story. But one thing I find fascinating is in the yearbook of the Salvation Army, the annual yearbook. I have an example right here with me of a recent yearbook of the Salvation Army. But in the yearbook of the Salvation Army, it's very interesting that there are 3 founders of the Salvation Army who are mentioned right at the beginning of the yearbook. And this has been going on for some time now. Of course, William and Catherine, we're familiar with them as the co-founders of the Salvation Army, but Bramwell Booth is named in the yearbook of the Salvation Army officially as one of the founders of the Salvation Army. And so we want to remember him for that. And as one of the founders of the Salvation Army, what were his great contributions? And so the biography, we're hoping, will bring out those contributions and seeing those in a very, very good and positive light.
I think I'm right that Bramwell was born in 1856. Is that correct, Roger?
Yes, he was born in 1856.
Okay, so in 1856, so he would have been in his late teen, early 20 years when the name of the organization was changed from the Christian Mission to the Salvation Army.
Yes.
Do you think he played any role in that transition to the military language of the Salvation Army?
He definitely played a role and was very important in the shaping of the Christian mission also, and very much a part of the Christian mission. One good example of that is that in the Christian mission, although there were no organized ministries of the Christian mission. In other words, each Christian mission station met the needs of the people who were local to that station. Except in 1870, William Booth decided that he would have a Food for the Millions program. And so the Food for the Millions program was going to be the one organized program of the Christian mission that covered all Christian mission stations. And the person that he put in charge of that was his 14-year-old son, Bramwell Booth, and put him in charge with a very little known person, but very important in the Christian mission days and the Army days, in fact, a man by the name of James Flawn. James Flawn had been in the catering business, we would call it today, in the food business. And so when he was saved in the Christian mission and working in the Christian mission, he worked along with Bramwell Booth in this Food for the Millions program. So even at the age of 14, Bramwell Booth is having a very important part in the Christian mission. And also, he's beginning to preach at that time as well. and as are others, but he's beginning to preach in the Christian mission. Once the Christian mission is ready for a change in the Salvation Army, and we were already using kind of Salvation Army terminology. And some of the Christian missioners were already calling themselves captains. They were referring to William Booth as the general, not the general superintendent anymore, but the general and so forth. But Bramwell Booth was right on board with that change, and was one of the persons as William and George Scott Railton and Bramwell Booth were thinking about what to name this new movement. They thought quickly about, well, let's name it the Volunteer Army. They said, no, let's name it the Salvation Army. And so Bramwell Booth even helped to give it its name. And then from then on was absolutely instrumental in shaping the Salvation Army, as Peter Farthing says, in being the architect of the Salvation Army.
So at that young age, bearing that much responsibility, the Booths had several children, and the dynamic in the family wasn't always healthy or strong through the years. What place did Bramwell have within the family?
I think there's something kind of Victorian about his place in the family, because being the eldest son, I think in that Victorian world, it was pretty much assumed that the eldest son would take on kind of the family business, if we could call it that. And so Bramwell Booth, as the eldest son, right from the very beginning, was in a sense almost programmed to be the person who would lead the family business along with his father, and in this case, along with his mother as well. Initially, he hesitated about that a bit. He himself actually was very interested in science and wanted to be a medical doctor, but the family convinced him that he was really destined by God to be a preacher and a leader. And so he becomes very important in the shaping of kind of the family ethos as the preacher. That worked well in Christian mission days as other children came into the family. But then when the Christian mission became the Salvation Army, Bramwell Booth was given the title of Chief of the Staff. Now, he never was as we understand it today, he never was a commissioned Salvation Army officer. So he wasn't a commissioner. George Scott Railton was the first commissioner in the Salvation Army, but he was given the title of Chief of the Staff. So everybody recognized that he was second to William Booth, and the other members of the family kind of, in a sense, fell in line with that initially, because the other members of the family were, like Bramwell, very charismatic. They were preachers, they were administrators, and so forth. However, as the years went on, there started to be a bit of a crack in that family solidarity, and eventually, largely because of William and Bramwell, eventually we lost three of the Booth children. Now, Catherine Booth went with her husband she only went out of allegiance to her husband. She didn't agree with her husband being caught up with a movement in Zion, Illinois, but that was more of a following after kind of a cultic leader. But two of the children, Ballington Booth and Herbert Booth, were both really troubled by the autocracy of both William and Bramwell. And at the time when they left, Ballington Booth was in America, and he and his wife left the army and joined and founded the Volunteers of America. And Herbert Booth was an Australian. He and his wife left the army, and Herbert became kind of an independent evangelist. But largely the debate was over the position of William as general and of Bramwell as chief of the staff, and of their call for absolute loyalty and absolute obedience to the word of the general. Well, that just wasn't going to go in a more kind of a democratic culture in which these people were living. So that did start to break a bit, and that became problematic.
Just say a little bit about what Bramwell was like as a person. What was his personality like? what was attractive about him?
Yes, I think he was a very attractive person. He was he was rather a gentle soul in some regards. As I mentioned earlier, he had serious questions about his standing up and preaching, and serious questions about being an administrator and so forth, and was rather hesitant, and in a sense had to be pushed a bit to take on these kind of responsibilities. But he was a bit of a gentle soul, and I think that's why he was a very interesting person in terms of his mind, in terms of reason. As I mentioned earlier, also he loved science. That kind of intrigued him. When you read the writings of Bramwell Booth, you will find quotations from all over the map, not just from Christian leaders and Christianity through the centuries, but from other sources as well. So obviously he was well read. He was a person who I think really enjoyed reading theology. He was very interested in the doctrine of Christology, in the doctrine of the full humanity of Jesus and the full divinity of Christ, and how these interacted with each other, and that comes out in his writings occasionally. So he was kind of a well-rounded person in a sense of personality and of intellect as well. He had a happy marriage by all accounts, and a happy home life, and so I think this was a person that you'd be pleased to meet. Now, to be sure, once we become the Salvation Army, once he becomes the chief of the staff, there gets a bit of an edge on Bramwell, as he calls people to ultimate loyalty and ultimate commitment, and to him and to William and to the Salvation Army. And he was rather difficult handling people who left the Salvation Army. And we've already mentioned Catherine, his sister, and Ballington and Herbert. And he actually, unfortunately, he saw them as traitors when they left the Salvation Army. Not only those three, but other officers as well. So he had forgotten along the way that his father left Methodism and saw it as the leading of God. But Bramwell couldn't quite bring himself to see that with people who left the army. So the army became everything to him, and in a sense, his autocracy, I think, in a sense, hid some of his gentler side and some of his more reasonable side at times. So a very complicated person, no doubt.
If you were to compare him with both his mother and his father, do you think that he inherited more from one than the other in terms of his personality and who he was?
That's a good question. I always say both of his parents were very autocratic. So I think we think of William as an autocrat, right, like his mentor, John Wesley. We don't often think of Catherine as an autocrat, but she was as autocratic as William. So if he inherited anything ultimately, it was that kind of autocratic nature, which set him up as chief of the staff, then set him up as general, and then set him up to want to name his successor. So it's hard to see. But he was probably a bit closer to his mother. The letters, the correspondence between them, I think, demonstrate this. His father, William, was at times kind of hard on Bramwell, not just as a son, but hard on Bramwell as the chief of the staff. There's that famous line from William about 1889 during the dock strike, saying to Bramwell, go and do something, as though Bramwell hadn't been doing anything during this great strike that was taking place in London. And Bramwell had been working very hard. So he might have been a little harder on Bramwell, but he was probably closer to his mother, but he inherited an autocratic nature from both of them, for sure.
You've written previously about the what you've described as the second conversion experience of William Booth in 1889, 1890, as we see Booth's language and the mission of the army expand to what William Booth called salvation for both worlds. What role did Bramwell play in that movement of the army, the expansion of the army's mission in 1889, 1890?
That's a very important question. I actually have a little quotation I'm going to read here tonight. But first of all, Bramwell was certainly on board with the way the Darkest England scheme was shaping up. And I think we need to, it's always important to remember that the ministry of the Salvation Army in various places in the world to the poor, to the underprivileged, to help the people and so forth, that did not begin at the instigation of William Booth. That began as Salvationists first in Australia and in America and Canada and other places saw the need to help the poor. And then William saw what was going on, and he had always wanted to do this. And so he felt that it was time to organize this in the Darkest England scheme. And Bramwell was on board with that. Now, what happened was about 1898, William Booth decided to hand over the administration of the entire Darkest England scheme to Bramwell. So Bramwell took that over, no small task. And that's, by the way, parenthetically, when William Booth became known as an international evangelist. That's when he started his motor campaigns through England, Scotland, and Wales. That's when he visited much more than he had visited abroad, especially coming to America many times to preach. He was part of that transatlantic revivalism that was going on in the 19th century. That's when he was kind of recognized, William was recognized as an international evangelist, and Bramwell was running the Darkest England scheme. So that's very important. Now there's a however to this, and the one portion I do want to read is a very interesting quotation from Bramwell about the Darkest England scheme that I'd like to just a couple small paragraphs here. But when William Booth died in 1912 and Bramwell was named as the successor, Bramwell was asked by a newspaper reporter, he was asked to describe the Darkest England scheme and what has come out of the Darkest England scheme. So the scheme starts in 1890. This is now 1912. Bramwell is now the general. And here is what Bramwell said. Now, this is the person who led the Darkest England scheme. Here is what he said to that newspaper reporter. He said, "My answer is that I have always looked on the Darkest England scheme and what came out of it as a comparatively small, though essential, part of the work of the Salvation Army, as a link rather than the main body of the thing. I say essential because it was and is an expression of the passion at the heart of the organism itself, but as such, it takes a subordinate place in my own conception of the history and, shall I say, the hopes of the Army. At the same time, there is no doubt that the scheme has done two good things for the Army, as well as a good thing for the world. It helped the Army into the eye of those who were compassionate for the poor, but under the influence of a generous humanitarianism, which hitherto looked upon the Army as little more than a small religious sect struggling for its own existence. Secondly, it opened the way for the Army to use a vast weight of previously unemployed power in its own ranks, because it provided a platform for action other than the platform of talking and solo singing, of great religious functions, and the publication of religious literature. It provided work for another type of soldier, the man or woman who could act but not talk. So far as its reflex effect upon the Army is concerned, the Darkest England scheme has fully justified itself." So that is very interesting that Bramwell would try to put this, what we call the social ministry of the Salvation Army, in context of Army history. And he says of the hopes of the Army. Now he's just become general, so he's going to be leading the Army. So that's interesting that he had these thoughts about the Army as and its Darkest England scheme as the general.
How would you compare the leadership of the Army, the way in which, or the direction that the Army went under Bramwell's leadership in comparison with the leadership under his father?
I think first of all, the leadership under Bramwell, it seems as though in a sectarian movement and a new church movement, it seems as though the second generation is always trying to preserve what the first generation gained. And that certainly was true of Bramwell. He inherited a pretty mighty army. It was still going around the world and so forth. It was very strong in Britain. So he inherited that. And for Bramwell, maintaining that was very important. Now, he still had a great missionary spirit to him as well. In 1914, for example, he sends 100 Scandinavian officers, 100 of them to India to work in India, to do the work of the army in India. So he still had this very great kind of missionary kind of impulse to him, but maintaining the army was very important to him as well. And so that's, it's not uncommon for the second generation to want to maintain what had been so advanced in the first generation. There's no doubt that William had a much more, what shall I say, imaginative understanding of the millennium and of the army bringing about the millennium here on Earth. Bramwell inherited some of that, but you don't see that in the writings of Bramwell. And of course, he lived through World War I, and World War I pretty much destroyed anyone's vision of a world becoming Christianized. And so Bramwell was, in a sense, a realist. And living through the catastrophe of World War I, he must have realized that postmillennialism that wasn't going to come about the way his father had envisioned it. But there were still possibilities there for the hope for the future. But he was not a postmillennialist in the kind of the fervent evangelical, what shall I say, imaginative, creative way that his father was.
In your research, as you've prepared to write and work with Peter Farthing on writing this biography, have there been some surprises about Bramwell that you've discovered in your research? Things that have taken you quite by surprise?
There have been surprises, and in a sense, I think we've referred to a couple of them. One surprise, I think I maybe knew some of these things from other research, but hadn't really thought about them in terms of placing them in his life and biography. But a couple of them we've mentioned, for example, his wanting to become a medical doctor early on in life, and in a sense being pushed to become a preacher and an administrator in the army. And that was very difficult for Bramwell. I think I was surprised with how much he wrestled with that. Not so much with the decision of becoming a doctor, because that was kind of put out of his mind by his mother. But am I a preacher? Am I a good preacher? Do I have the gifts to be a preacher or an administrator? And so the wrestling with it, I think I've been a bit surprised by that, but we do see that. I think the second thing that was a surprise was this quotation that I just read about the Darkest England scheme, because for all the reasons we talked about. The greatest surprise, however, I have to say, I knew a little bit about this, but nothing like now that we've researched this. But the greatest surprise is, here was Bramwell Booth, this very rational, reasonable, kindly, rather gentle, I think, person in the Christian mission. And all through the Christian mission days and early army days, he loved, that would not be too strong a word, he loved to go to the all-night prayer meetings that the Christian mission used to have and that the Salvation Army used to have. And by all-night prayer meetings, they meant that literally. They would meet all night long and then freshen up in the morning and then go back to work. But these all-night prayer meetings were, the descriptions of them are the most unbelievable descriptions. And to try to envision Bramwell, as we knew him or as we're getting to know him, in the midst of these prayer meetings and loving it, loving every minute of it, is the greatest surprise. How do you put these two things together? Because in these prayer meetings, in these all-night prayer meetings, they were not quiet prayer meetings by any a stretch of the imagination. And the Christian Mission magazines and the writers of the day tell us exactly what was going on. People would come together. There was a lot of crying. There was a lot of screaming. There was people would go into what were called glory fits. Now, I'm not sure what glory fits were, but the glory fits sent them onto the ground, and they would rush up to the mercy seat and have their glory fit in the mercy seat and fall down at the mercy seat and so forth. And the Christian Mission magazine, and more importantly, probably Harold Begbie, who's the official biography of William Booth, Harold Begbie reports in that biography, he says, when I was researching this biography, Bramwell Booth tells me that beyond all doubt, there were people in those all-night prayer meetings who did not walk to the altar, but who levitated to the altar. So Bramwell Booth witnessed levitation to the mercy seat. And it's just hard to connect all of this with Bramwell Booth. And then Harold Begbie has an interesting recollection, in a sense, from Bramwell Booth. Bramwell Booth said, so you get to the mercy seat during these all-night prayer meetings, you got people with these glory fits, you got people levitating and so forth. And so he said there would be doctors present, and the doctors would help to lift the fallen bodies of all these people into other rooms. And then there's a great line. It says, so that the meetings will continue without distraction. Now, as I say to myself, I think the distraction train has long left the station in those all-night prayer meetings, but so that the meetings might continue without distraction. You must not have any distraction. You've had glory fits and levitation and shouting and screaming and fainting and everything, but we can't have any distraction in the meetings. So how do you reconcile that with this very reasonable, kindly person, in a way, a gentle person, I think, in some ways? How do you reconcile that? Well, the only way I can is sometimes these sectarian movements manifest in their early days. They manifest these kinds of things. Wesley had the same thing in his early days of the revival in England. And eventually, there's kind of a settling down period. And evidently, that was even true with Bramwell and even with the Salvation Army. Because when you start reading Salvation Army history of the 1880s, 90s into 1900 and so forth, you're not reading about these all-night prayer meetings anymore. So I guess there was eventually a settling down and a diminishing of levitation.
Okay, I don't know quite how to respond to that. If you mentioned early on this evening that in some ways the memory that sort of Salvationists who have a very cursory understanding of Salvation Army history, the memory that they have of Bramwell Booth is his removal from office in 1929. Could you say a little bit more about that what led to that and how that happened?
Right. There were really two things that led to it. First of all, by the deed poll in which the Salvation Army was kind of legally established, the general was able to name his successor. So William was able to name his successor in a sealed envelope, and of course that was Bramwell. But then in 1904, the deed poll, there was kind of a supplement to the deed poll. And the supplement to the deed poll created what we know as the High Council. And the High Council was established in case a general was unfit for office, that the High Council could be called by 9, I believe it was 9 commissioners could legally call a High Council, come together and determine whether the general was indeed unfit for office. That's the wording, unfit for office. That was established in 1904. Once you get to Bramwell's, so that's one thing. The second thing is there was a reform movement kind of bubbling up among some of the commissioners. In fact, Bramwell's own sister, Evangeline, was part of that reform movement. There was kind of a reform movement getting going here, even before 1929, that maybe maybe the general should be elected. Maybe having the general name his successor is not a good thing. Might have been all right for William on to Bramwell, but maybe we should change that now. So there were two things kind of in the working here. Now we come to 1929. For 9 months, Bramwell was unfit for office, but in terms of ill health, he was out of the picture for up to 9 months. And the commissioners saw this as a real problem. Is he unfit for office in terms of his own health? And so they finally called the High Council in January of 1929 to consider that. The other thing that then they were also going to consider is this kind of reform movement. Should the High Council move, if we deposed Bramwell as general, should we also move to have a general by election from now on by the High Council? And so the circumstances came about that Bramwell Booth was removed from office because of ill health, and there were only 5 votes that voted to keep him in office. And if the majority had voted to keep him in office, that would have meant that he still would have been able to name his successor. But once they voted to take him out of office because he was unfit for office because of health reasons, then that opened the way to where should we go in the future? And that, I think that became a pretty easy decision in a sense to say, let's have the High Council from now on elect the general. And so step 1, he's unfit for office. And then step 2, we elect a general, and they elected General Higgins. Higgins was Bramwell Booth's chief of the staff. So a pretty natural person to elect as the general. So he was elected as general. So those were the 2 issues, kind of side-by-side issues in a sense. And as we said right at the very beginning of this, rather tragic ending for Bramwell. In fact, he died on June 16th of 1929. So soon after the High Council, soon after he was deposed, soon after a new general was elected, Bramwell Booth was promoted to glory. So those are the issues. That's what happens around the 1929 issue. Yeah.
If you could imagine a Salvation Army without having had Bramwell Booth as the second general, what do you think it would look like? How would the Army be different if we hadn't had Bramwell Booth?
If we hadn't had Bramwell, General Larson says that Bramwell Booth was the greatest general next to William Booth. If we hadn't had Bramwell Booth to put into place everything that kind of created an army for God for the future, I doubt if the Army would have lasted another generation or 2. I think it kind of evolved into something. I don't know what it would have evolved in, but Bramwell Booth was so instrumental in setting up the orders and regulations for officers, the orders and regulations for soldiers, the command structure, and so forth, setting up this thing that we know as the Salvation Army. Being the architect for the building, in a sense, that if we hadn't had him, I really don't. I think we might have been a bit like the Volunteers of America. I mean, they were good for a generation or 2 in terms of structure but they didn't have anyone to kind of continue the original vision of Ballington and Maud Booth. And so the Volunteers of America evolved pretty much into not a strong religious evangelical organization, but at least here in America, the Volunteers of America is a charitable organization only. So I think we owe Bramwell credit for what the Army got established as the Salvation Army. Yeah.
I know with both William Booth and Catherine Booth, you've had a hand in collecting and editing a collection of shorter writings of both William and Catherine Booth.
Yes.
Are there shorter writings or writings of Bramwell Booth that are worth Salvationists reading?
There are. And first, I'll say my thanks to you, Don, and to Andrew Eason for those 2 projects, because that was your and Andrew's kind of vision, and the same thing could easily be done with Bramwell Booth. There are now I think I've read all the books that he wrote, and as I'm reading these books, I'm saying to myself, why aren't we reading this material, or why aren't we reprinting or republishing some of this material? It's some of it are real gems, but lost now, unless anyone happens to be picking up a book of Bramwell Booth, and some of his war cry articles. If you read the old war cries and see his articles and everything, some of the war cry articles, there are some real gems in the writings of Bramwell Booth, which I think Salvationists might have even been aware of some of the writings we put in our writings of Catherine or writings of William. I don't think they'd even be aware of anything that Bramwell Booth wrote, which is unfortunate. These are real gems. It would be an easy project to put together. Yeah.
Are there themes that jump out at you as you've read Bramwell's writings? Particular themes?
There are themes, and certainly one of them is holiness. No question about that. And in the present songbook, we have 5 of Bramwell Booth's songs. I'm not sure, I'd have to track this down to see how many were originally there, but we've carried over 5 of his songs. I mentioned earlier also, he was theologically very kind of theologically astute. The theme of atonement comes through quite a bit with Bramwell's writings, and Christ dying on the cross and for our sins, and what justification is all about, what regeneration is all about. He clearly mentions, and this is so much of a discussion today when you're reading people like N.T. Wright, but he clearly mentions the importance of the place of the resurrection of Christ in the full atonement story. He had this interest, as I mentioned, in Christology. He occasionally, he'll in the writings you get the human Jesus, the divine Christ. How do they relate to each other? What are we seeing now in the Bible in this passage? Are we seeing the human Jesus, or are we seeing the divine Christ? He was very interested in those kinds of topics, no doubt about that. So now also many themes about officership, many articles on officership. Unfortunately, that's where Bramwell gets a little hard to read at times, because he really, really comes down hard on officers who have left the army. And you'll read paragraph after paragraph, they are traitors, they never should have left the army, and so forth. So it comes down pretty hard on, but then eases up when he talks about the glory of officership and the privilege of officership and so forth. So you do get a bit of a mixed bag when he's talking about officers, but he writes a great deal about officers. And those 2 themes, however, of loyalty and obedience come through time and time and time again. And also his sense, not really a democratic sense of officership, but a very autocratic sense of officership. So sometimes the stuff on officership is a little hard to read, but at other times there's some good stuff there too. So, but yes, there's material from Bramwell that the Army should be reading.
In your judgment, doing this work on the biography, in your judgment, what would be Bramwell's greatest contributions to the Salvation Army?
The maybe 2 things, but one would certainly be the structure. The greatest contribution in terms of the structure, the architects setting up the army to be able, so that it could move forward into a 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation. That would be one thing. I think the second thing would be he becomes kind of the model. Now, at the end, it was difficult, of course, but he becomes kind of the model as best he is able to do, given the hierarchy that he believes in and so forth. But he does become the model of the servant leader. When all is said and done, I really believe that Bramwell Booth was there to serve for the sake of the kingdom and for the sake of the church. Now we got some difficulties with the family and so forth. But when you look at the big picture of Bramwell, I think he shows that. And he wrote one of his best books. If we were going to reproduce a whole book of Bramwell, it would be his book on servants of all. It's really a wonderful book. And he doesn't mention himself, of course, but you see him coming through that text as you're reading the text. So to be a general who is a servant of the people, and he was seen as that. He was beloved. His 70th birthday party, if you want to, I guess you could call it that, was held in Royal Albert Hall. So they packed Royal Albert Hall for the 70th birthday of Bramwell Booth. This shows you how much he was loved and respected by not only by Salvationists, but by the general public. So I would say that's another Bramwell as an example, I think, is we're hoping that this book will demonstrate that. Yeah.
Now you and Peter Farthing are progressing with the writing of the biography?
We're on chapter 8 now, so we're about halfway through the book, I would say, maybe not quite. We are really in sync with each other. One chapter has had as many as 7 rewrites to it. So, Peter Farthing, for those of you who might know him, if you've read other material by him, or he produced a wonderful CD called Our People, which is a wonderful 2-hour CD. I don't know, Don, if you have seen it, but it's really well done. So when Peter and I really talked about this, where are we going to go with this? He really knows how to tell the story. And so he's telling the story of Bramwell. I think my contribution, when he gives me the story, then maybe I can add to it a little bit. Maybe I can fortify it a little bit with material, with other bibliographic material and so forth. So we'll send it back and forth to each other. It might go through 5 or 6 or 7 edits a chapter until we feel pretty comfortable with the chapter, and then move on. So we feel we're in a good place with the biography. Yeah.
And do you have a projected completion date when you think you'll have completed the writing of the biography?
We have projected it for the fall of 2021. So we are hoping that we could have it in place by 2021. That may not happen. We may have to stretch that out a bit, but the Army's committed to it here in America through Crest Books, and the International Salvation Army will also publish it in London. So to be published simultaneously in the Salvation Army by America and international headquarters. We decided not to go to an outside publisher. We thought, now with William and Catherine in the writings, their names are pretty well known, 19th century history, 19th century women's studies, so forth, church studies. Bramwell Booth, we felt, probably is not that well known. And so we're keeping it internal, and we hope it'll have a great distribution internally. And then perhaps if it does have a strong enough internal distribution, maybe we can get it outside as well. We would love to do that, but right now we're publishing it through the Army.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Roger. This has been delightful. We're going to take a brief break for a Booth University College commercial.
Good.
And then we'll be back to take a couple of questions before we conclude the evening.
Thank you, Don.
Not all of us set out to change the world. But for those of us who do, knowing where to begin can be hard. Because the world, though beautiful, is broken in so many ways. Some ways that make it seem like one person can't possibly make a difference, and other ways that are just easier to ignore. But we don't believe in an easy world. We believe in a better world. At Booth University College, change starts on the front lines, where we can make the biggest difference, and where others might be afraid to go. We fight for justice. We bridge divides, and we share ideas. Because as an institution grounded in the Christian faith, we know a better world is possible, and it's within our ability to make it happen. Whether that world is halfway across the globe, or right around the corner. We believe in making a difference in more than just our own lives, that the skills to change the world can be taught, fostered, inspired, and strengthened, and that it doesn't take an army to make an impact. But it helps. Whoever you are, whatever you believe, wherever you're going, a better world begins here. Booth University College. Education for a better world.
All right, we do have a couple of questions that have come in during the conversation that Roger and I've had this evening. If you are quick and you want to submit another question, feel free to go ahead and do so, and we'll see if we can get to it. Just want to ask a couple of the questions here, Roger, for you. The first one I see is, are there any unique long-term influences from Bramwell that you see in the contemporary Salvation Army?
Yes, I think I'll come back to something we mentioned earlier. Thank you for that question. But I think the long term was really captured by General Larson in his recent book on the Booths. He wrote a book on the Booth family. And I agree that the long term is the model. Bramwell Booth is the model. If we look at the life and ministry of Bramwell Booth carefully, we will see a model for what leadership should be in today's world. I don't think that has changed. So that's what I would say his law, and that's where we're hoping that this biography will speak to that very issue and provide that for people to see.
What would be some of the characteristics that you see there as being exemplified in Bramwell Booth's life? I think you've said some of them before, but just recapping here,
right.
What would be some of those characteristics that you think stand out for Bramwell Booth as a leader?
I think the main characteristic is to see himself as a servant leader. Years ago, a church asked me to come for a weekend and to do a series on leadership models in the Bible. And so I wrote back to them and said, I'm glad to come and do a series, but I'm sorry, I can't. There's no leadership models in the Bible except one, and that's the motto of the servant leader. And if we want to talk about that, I'm delighted. And Jesus was, of course, the great example of that. So Bramwell Booth as a model of what it means to be a servant leader in your day. To me, that's the outstanding thing about Bramwell. And that's what if there's anything that comes out of this book, that certainly is one of the major themes that we hope will come out of it. No doubt about that. Also, he was a man of his time. He certainly recognized he was able to minister in spite of very tragic world in which he lived, especially the First World War, 1914 to 1918. And to be a leader in times of tragedy, in times of extraordinarily world difficulty, and on the other side of that, to still have hope, for the future and so forth. That's pretty remarkable. And Bramwell Booth is an example of that. He held the army together from 1914, the International Army. He held that together during those years. And as an English citizen, nevertheless, after the war, he still made he was really wanted to and made time to visit Germany many times after the war and to speak in Germany after the war. So there's I could tell a quick story about that, but I guess should I tell?
Go ahead.
Okay,
Yep,
I'll tell a quick story about his visiting Germany after the war. And one of the biographies talks about this, but he was speaking in an open air, and listening to him very intently, evidently, was Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his mother, and heard Bramwell Booth preach. And then one of the biographers of Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, from that moment on, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his mother began to attend church. They had been nominal Lutherans, kind of church at home up until that time. But there's no doubt that Bramwell Booth made some significant contribution to the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That's pretty amazing. So that kind of servant leadership and worldwide leadership, working through the difficulties, that's Bramwell. Yeah.
Okay, great, good. Here's a question. If Bramwell was our general today, what do you think he'd say about our social services expression today?
That's a very good question. That quotation that I read of Bramwell, says it all, I think. He put it in perspective. So he certainly would want, above all things, for the social ministry of the Salvation Army to be put in perspective of the whole ministry of the Salvation Army. So yeah. He wrote a letter to Evangeline that I've seen, because the Salvation Army during the war was going to the front and serving the boys and everything. And he wrote a letter to Evangeline, and he said to Evangeline, now remember, however we're ministering to these folks up front, remember, we're not going to do them any good if we don't minister to them spiritually as well. So remember, we've got, a reason to minister for them, for the whole person. So I think Bramwell would remind us, unless we're ministering to the whole person, physical and spiritual, we're not ministering in the way that the Darkest England scheme was established.
Here's an interesting question. Have you read a book, The Power of Salvation Army Officers by Bramwell's wife?
I have not, but I think I probably need to. But I have not. I haven't read anything by Florence.
Okay,
that's probably on our reading list.
Okay, well, there you are. There's something,
yes,
something more. Good question here. Can you tell us something more of the go do something story?
Yes. The go do
seems to have been important to Bramwell, and for him to recall for others.
Yes.
It's become sort of emblematic of today's Salvation Army.
Yes.
Why is it such a powerful story, do you think?
Well, it's a little bit of an unfortunate story, because we say that that's where the social ministry of the Army began. And it moved on from there. That is not true. There had been a social ministry of the Army since 1883, December of 1883 in Australia, as the Salvation Army in Australia began working in what were called the prison gate brigades. And then in other places in the world, there was this ministry out of compassion, loving God, loving your neighbor, that the Army was doing. And William Booth saw this, was pleased with this, rejoiced in this, and he wanted to organize this. So the go and do something story is not the beginning of the Darkest England scheme or the beginning of our social ministry. We often say that it is, but it isn't. It's an interesting story because in England at the time, there was what was called the dockers' strike. All the dock workers went on strike. Literally tens of thousands of people went on strike. And the Salvation Army was on the side of the dock workers, by the way, not on the side of the owners of the factories, but on the docks, but on the side of the workers in the docks and so forth. But what that meant was that in London, we had never seen this before. People were sleeping on the streets who mothers and children and families were sleeping on the streets in December in London simply because they couldn't pay the rent on their apartment because they were on strike. So this became a massive problem. And Bramwell was doing everything that he could. William was rather hard on Bramwell, saying, go and do something. Bramwell was already doing a lot. But it is an interesting story. But there is a context to that story that I think is important. So, yeah.
What do you think would be, there's another question, what do you think would be some of Bramwell's greatest challenges if he had to adjust to leadership in the 21st century?
Leadership in the 21st century. I think probably his greatest challenge, first of all, there'd be the whole issue of social ministry of the Army being in context with the holistic ministry of the Army, ministering to the whole person, which means ministering to the physical and the spiritual part of the person, ministering holistically. But I think Bramwell would have to make adjustments because he'd be ministering in a post-Christian world virtually. especially if you take England as an example. When Bramwell was the general, there were about 150,000 soldiers in England. There were 5,000 officers, and there were 700 cadets in England when Bramwell was the general in England. So those statistics are pretty remarkable. If you look at a yearbook today in England, you will know that that is not true in England today. The Salvation Army in Western Europe has suffered a great decline, along with the church. So I think Bramwell's greatest challenge would be, how do we minister in a post-Christian world? Especially in Western Europe, that post-Christian world is coming over to Canada, to America. How do we minister in a post-Christian world? How do we do that? I think that would be a great challenge for Bramwell to kind of figure that out.
This is the last question, Roger, and I don't know, this might finish us off completely, but what do you think attracted Bramwell to those prayer meetings? This writer says, I've heard someone say that maybe we threw the baby out with the bathwater in an attempt to control the manifestations in the early meetings. So what do you think attracted him to those prayer meetings?
A good question. There is no doubt, Bramwell is very clear about this, that what attracted him to those meetings was, this was the work of the Spirit, as far as he was concerned. This was Pentecost all over again in those meetings, as far as Bramwell was concerned. There is no doubt about that. This kind of freedom of the Spirit that manifested itself in these ways. So he was very supportive of these meetings, theologically or biblically, as well as attending the meetings and participating in the meetings. But sectarian movements settled down in the second generation. And even Bramwell, we don't see him attending, we don't see the army having all night of prayer meetings. Now, it might not be a bad idea in terms of this question to rethink this a bit. Maybe the Salvation Army needs to be more open to the work of the Holy Spirit, as Bramwell was, and as those Christian missioners were, and as the early Salvationists were, and see where the Spirit is leading the army and what the manifestations are going to be, and so forth. So good question, and maybe even a challenge for us today. Where is the Spirit leading us today? Yeah. Where is the work of the Holy Spirit today in the army? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Roger, so much for this evening. This has been a great delight personally for me, but I think for those who've been participating and listening, I think it's been a great experience to hear you share what you're learning about Bramwell Booth and have learned about Bramwell Booth in your work on the biography with Peter Farthing. We're most grateful for your participation tonight.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Our next Earl Robinson Memorial Lecture takes place on Tuesday, November 24th at 7 p.m. When Commissioner Christine McMillan will make a presentation entitled Tilting at Windmills. And we're looking forward to that. So I would invite you to go to the Booth University College website and register for that webinar in advance, and want to be able to welcome you back for that occasion. As I said at the beginning this evening, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube, on the Booth University College YouTube channel, as soon as we're able to do so. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate you coming tonight, and we hope you've enjoyed the evening.